but I don't think there's a model that's necessarily the one yet. Didn't totally answer your question, but it's the truth. Was there a question over here or no? Okay, you?
One of the Mark Capital Climate Resolve. One of the hardest decisions that's often made in terms of bike lanes and some level bike share is the removal of parking. And I know Chicago struggled with that a little bit. It takes a bold decision to say we're taking away, quote unquote, X amount of parking spots.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could speak to the leadership politically and how you were able to overcome the feat of that.
Well, it's doubly hard in Chicago because in Chicago we sold our parking meters for $1.2 billion for 75 years. So not only is there controversy around getting rid of the parking in front of so-and-so's business or condo building, excuse me, but you got to pay, 12 grand a year for that space. So we've found a system for reallocating spaces. Like we take a space here, we move it here. And then businesses like on Milwaukee Avenue, for instance, a lot of them recognize that the people on bikes that are going 7 miles an hour, much more likely going to stop in and buy a chai or some dog food or whatever it is that they sell, and somebody speeding by in a car to the suburbs at 40. And it's really interesting on Milwaukee Avenue, actually, is that when you start on Milwaukee Avenue down the core of the city by Blommer's Chocolate Factory, old, historic, beautiful buildings that are really meant to be seen at low speed. And as you get farther out Milwaukee Avenue toward the edge of the city, they actually designed the buildings so you could recognize them at 40 miles an hour. And that's a fact. I'm not an architect, but that's the difference. And so when you get far out there, it's really tough to convince people, and there's a huge battle going on. I think I saw John Greenfield here running around. He just did a story on that. He's from Chicago, on the sort of uproar up on upper Milwaukee Ave, because there's much more of a car culture than down on Milwaukee Ave closer to the core of the city, where the restaurants and bars pretty willingly gave up all the parking in front of their place. Now, what we did is we had to find spaces around the corner to offset the cost. So thank God you haven't sold your meters. Questions? Yes, ma'am?
This is one more from the Bikes California. You talked about the marketing and storytelling. For cities using infrastructure, it's challenging to get education and software. Have you guys come up with any innovative ideas or ways to partner with some of the brilliant people in the creative industries to help get money to have more education campaigns and advertising?
Well, I'll say that's one of the reasons. She asked about education, campaigns and marketing, and how to get more money for them, and how to be creative and partner maybe with the private sector. So that's why we were so focused on Divvy being such a home run from a marketing standpoint, because it's earned media. Like, go Google Divvy Bike Share and you will see nothing but positive articles everywhere. And you're talking about 3,000 bikes constantly roving around the city, stations everywhere. You see the Divvy van there. So, not that that's answering your question, because I'll answer it in a different way too, but the things that you are doing, you got to do them really, really well. And the things you have out in the right of way, do it really, really well. Now also, every DOT should have access to free advertising within their bus shelter contract, on their transit systems. So for Divvy, for public safety campaign, like we have a public safety campaign about not hitting pedestrians, paying attention to driving. It's really graphic. It's pretty gruesome, actually. And we argued internally about it because people are like, oh, it's too gruesome. I'm like, yeah, but when it happens, it's gruesome. So why not represent it as it is when it happens? And we took the new Big Belly solar trash compactors all over the city, and we plastered them with these images. We also put up 32 mannequins, which cost us almost nothing, representing the 32 people that were killed by cars the previous year, and put them on the busiest streets. Then we put them in the transit system. So there are low cost, I mean, it's a whole conversation, but there are low cost ways. The important thing is to put a transportation demand management program in place that you can fund with CMAQ money, and then make it your marketing arm. That's really the best thing you can do, I think. And you can spend millions, and you can have a real impact. And I think when you look at the 7.5% drop this year in fatalities, it's not all one thing or another. I mean, speed cameras are a big thing, but I think the campaigns that we had are big. The paranoia that we created around speeding, and so on. Do we have time for one last question? Maybe two? Yes?
Eric Sachs, one of the things I represent, Sam Schwartz here.
Great company.
and also some developers. From your perspective, how do you get folks in DOTs to actually start looking at transportation from a different modal perspective? It's very easy for them to default back to the automobile and make the same mistakes over and over again. What are some of the 2 or 3 tricks in getting entrenched bureaucrats, and I don't mean that in a bad way, to look at things differently?
So the first thing is what I said earlier, which is to empower them to make mistakes. The second thing is to organize the DOT so that there's a balance of power between the planners and the engineers. And in Chicago, they had already set it up much better than I had in DC. They had it set up so instead of planning, they had project development. Within project development, the traffic engineers reported up to the planners. Changes the whole dynamic.
Yay!
Well, so basically, the project development team, which is run by the planning department basically, takes the projects up to 30%. Then they turn it over to the engineers to build it, and that's what they're great at. And they like it. I mean, it just works better. And actually, I will say that they're some of the most creative engineers I've ever worked with. And also in the bike program, we have one of the key guys, Nate Roseberry, is an engineer and a planner. And that's been really helpful in working with the state DOT and sort of talking engineer, which is a little different than human, No offense to the engineers, I'm kidding. So that's very important. And having some successes is the third thing. Like, have a little success, celebrate that success, give people a pat on the back. I mean, I've watched people go from like being totally against all the progressive transportation stuff to being a proponent of it in a little less than a year. In fact, one of them was a state DOT engineer who we brought into the tent. NACTO did a bunch of, with us, did a bunch of seminars on engineering, and actually engineering and thinking versus just following the METCD and the Green Book and just sort of doing. And that guy became a proponent of what we were doing in the city and is very helpful in getting things done. Are we out of time?
Just about.
Maybe one more?
One, go ahead.
Yeah.
Carl Fielding, I'm a planning consultant. You gave a great overview of all the options and what people are doing, and obviously LA is working on itself, and there's some priorities and things they're trying to implement. From your perspective, of your experience as well as seeing our city, if you were in charge here, what would be your top priorities?
My top priorities would be to, there's so many great big projects going on. All the transit stuff's amazing. I think that the bike share program is big, and doing it right is really important. But as I was telling some of these guys over lunch that work, transportation in the mayor's office, it's all the soft stuff that is quick, you can do it pretty cheaply, and it has the same impact on people's quality of life. Like, I was talking to them about the Capital Bike Share program in DC and the Silver Line. One is $12 billion, one was $1.2 million. More press and more positive press about Capital Bike Share, and it's probably had as much or more impact on people's quality of life. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for Mayor Garcetti to come in and run with all the great stuff that the last mayor did, but then do all the soft stuff that maybe didn't quite happen. And the other thing is, I think, more of a pedestrian-first policy, not maybe charging people $250 across the street, and focusing on safety. And if you do that, you'll have more people move downtown. You may even have some families living downtown, which I know is hard to believe, but it's happening all over DC and Chicago. Chicago lost 200,000 residents over the last decade, but it has the fastest growing downtown in the United States because that's where the amenities are. That's where people want to live, and it's safer.
So before we conclude and before we thank Gabe, I'd like to invite our Deputy Mayor, Rick Cole, to come up and say a few words.
How are you, Rick?
Great job, Gabe.
Thank you.
How many thought that this was a worthwhile way to spend the last couple of hours?
Thank you.
You were probably wondering why the Garcetti administration hasn't offered the DOT job to Gabe Klein. We have. But he's going to go into the private sector and revolutionize the country. So all he's really done today is inspire us about the direction we need to go. But sometimes we look to leaders to lead us to the promised land. The trouble is that if a leader can lead you to the promised land, then a leader can lead you out. So it's really important, if we want to have the things that Gabe has advocated for and the things that Gabe has actually produced in 2 other very tough environments, to do this, right? Don't ever have the illusion that it was easy to do this in Chicago or easy to do this in Washington, D.C., where it's really hard in Los Angeles. It was really hard, wasn't it, Gabe?
Yeah, I turned totally gray. This is touch of gray.
But it can be done. That's the point. It's not that it was hard, it's that doing the hard stuff is important. And so we are going to have new leadership at the Department of Transportation. We have new leadership here in the council and in the mayor's office. But leaders aren't defined by titles. Everybody in here is a leader because you're leading the way to a different paradigm for transportation in Los Angeles, and if we can do it in Los Angeles, we can do it in the world. So I just close with this story, and I want you to take this home and think about this when you think about how we achieve the things that Gabe has challenged us to do here in this great city. In the 30s, a group of African Americans met with, and their supporters met with Franklin Roosevelt to try